Three of my favorite people are on this session, so I'm delighted to see them all on the stage here today and really appreciate their time and interest. Our moderator for this final panel is John Diaz, who is the editorial page editor of the San Francisco Chronicle since 1996. He's won numerous state and national awards, served as a juror for the Pulitzer Prize in 2001 and 2002. Before joining the editorial page, he directed the paper's East Bay news coverage and was an assistant city editor. I've known John for over a decade, and I've always known him to be very thoughtful, very incisive, and I believe a step ahead of his peers. So we're really pleased that John is here today to build on the previous discussion and lead a conversation about how we might find our way to a brighter economic future in California. And John will introduce our two featured speakers. But let me just say that I consider them among the most innovative and inspirational people that I've met, crisscrossing the United States, and we're lucky to have them both here in the Bay Area. And John will say more. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. Robert, good afternoon, first of all. And Robert Reich had promised you a positive note. Well, we actually have to take it a step further by promising you a positive outlook, because the mission of this panel is to talk about how to build a brighter future in California, a brighter economic future. And we are honored to have with us two people who I've known for a number of years, who spend a lot of time thinking about and working on the issues of how do you develop this confluence between government and public policy and combine it with business development and job creation. Let me introduce, first of all, Angela Glover Blackwell, who is founder and CEO of PolicyLink, a group that she founded in 1999. I won't go into all the details of her resume. It's very impressive, as you'll see in her biography. But she has served on more boards than I could mention here. But I do want to note that she was co-chair of the Task Force on Poverty for the Center for American Progress. Please join me in welcoming Angela Glover Blackwell. And to my left is one of the most determined people I know, as evidenced by his presence here today. Carl Guardino is CEO of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. He is also quite an athlete, which is why he is in the wheelchair on the stage today. He had a bicycle accident, but I will save that for you to ask during the audience Q&A period as to what happened. Carl served a lot of roles, is very respected in the Silicon Valley. He heads the leadership group, which has 300 of the Silicon Valley's most respected companies represented. He's worked in the past for Hewlett-Packard as an executive position in government affairs. He's also worked for 6 years as a legislative aide in Sacramento. Please welcome Carl Guardino. What we'd like to do this afternoon is build on not only the report that was circulated today, which I've read over the last few days. It's really has some eye-opening information, but also the panel discussion this morning raised a lot of questions that I think we can take from there and have some forward-looking solutions, hopefully, for California. Let me start by posing the first question to Angela. What role do you think government can or should play in bringing about this brighter future for California? How does government need to get involved, and where should it get out of the way?
Well, thank you for the question. Happy to be here. Happy to be in this conversation with all of you. Government is going to have to play a very big role if California is to have a brighter future. And California's future is very much tied to the future of the nation, as you heard in the earlier conversation. One of the reasons that I think we're going to be particularly dependent on government is because the things that have to be addressed to set California up for a brighter future require sharp, focused, targeted intervention. And that intervention has to come out of some sense of where it is we're trying to go in the long term and how to be able to use short-term investments to be able to leverage other things. Let me go a little deeper from there. One of our problems here in California and nationally is that we think a little too short-term when we think about how to recover from this recession. We can't just go back to where we were before. It wasn't good. Where we were before is what got us to where we are today. And we have to avoid being nostalgic for a time that really never was. Because back when some of us were doing better, there were a lot of us who were not doing very well at all. And those numbers have increased, they've become more entrenched. And at the same time that we have to avoid being nostalgic for a time that never was, we have to make sure that we don't try to deny a future that is inevitable. And that inevitable future is a California in which the overwhelming majority of people of color, that is where the nation is moving, that's where California has already moved. By 2050, when the nation starts thinking about the fact that it becomes a nation in which the majority of people are people of color, 74% of all the residents of California will be people of color. 46.5% of all children nationally are children of color. 60% of all children in California are children of color. And so California is already where the nation is going. When we think about those children and their parents and their neighbors of color, Latino, African American, Native American, Asian Pacific Islander, there are a lot of gaps between where those populations are and where they need to be fully contributing Californians in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of job readiness, in terms of having access to communities that are communities of opportunity. All of those things are lacking. So as the nation thinks about its future and how to have an educated democracy, people who are educated and can engage in democratic activity, how to have a workforce that will help to contribute as we go forward, how to be able to tap the entrepreneurial spirit that the nation and the state really must tap in order to be able to be this nation that's going to be competitive in a global economy. It's clear that government needs to get involved in having the best educational system we can possibly have, the best job training programs we could possibly have, but also to improve communities with smart infrastructure investments. When you think about infrastructure, you got to invest in the right projects, public transportation as opposed to new roads and highways, the right people, making sure the people who need jobs are getting those jobs, and the right places. Too many people in California and nationally are being left behind because the places where they live are being left behind. All of those things that I've just talked about require public and private partnerships with the public setting the pace, setting the agenda, showing what it means to really invest. And if any place knows how to invest in people who have tremendous needs, it's California. It's what it did when it became the most incredible state in the United States. It took people who were not healthy, not educated, and poor, and it invested in them what they needed. That's the kind of government intervention that we need now.
Thank you, Angela. I want to put this question to Carl Guardino, but before I do, recall in the last session, Professor John Chauvin talked about the need for California, in his words, to wake up and have a pro-growth environment. Carl, you and I have talked before. I remember one time at an editorial board meeting putting the question to you of, do you think California is hostile to business? And the short answer you had was yes. Let me ask you that question in terms of the role of government. What role do you think government needs to play? Where does it need to get involved, and where does it need to get out of the way?
John, thank you, and thank you all for not leaving after Robert Reich left the room. We appreciate you staying here, and Angela, what a pleasure to share the stage with you. So many of your remarks, I know we're going to have a lot of common ground today, as California should, and historically had in making the state the robust place that it is. I do have one bone to pick with Mark Baldessari, though. Before the mics came on, he came with his back to you, but his face to us, and he said, "My 3 favorite people." Then he turned around with the mic on and he said, 3 of my favorite people. There is a big difference. So by the end of the panel, after saying that, he's going to say, my 2 favorite people.
I think what he told us, though, was on the record as far as this newspaper guy is concerned.
Always come with a newspaper guy with you. The question is so important about the role of government, especially in an innovation economy, which is my background in Silicon Valley, and so much of the entrepreneurial spirit of California, that it makes me want to relate a story. John Vasconcellos, liberal lion in the state legislature for 3 decades, one of my mentors and friends, relates the first time he met the founder of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, David Packard, the co-founder of Hewlett-Packard. And he walked into David's office, and John was tall, is tall. He's about 6'2". David Packard was about 6'4", and even more imposing. And John walked up and put out his hand. This was, by the way, 1966. This is when John still had a crew cut. But John walked up and put out his hand, and David Packard, instead of shaking his hand, pointed his finger towards John's chest and said, "You need us. You need us to create jobs, to have a strong economy, and to pay taxes." And John was kind of offended until David Packard turned that big finger on himself and poked himself in the chest and said, "And we need you. We need you to make sure that we have a good education system, good infrastructure, and a safety net for our most vulnerable citizens." It's a two-way street. It's in our enlightened self-interest in Silicon Valley to make sure that California succeeds. Because as California and our nation succeed, that means not only are we having those important programs around education that Angela mentioned and provisions for safety net, but we have an environment in which employers can survive and thrive. So I would add just 2 items before we move on to the other questions, and then questions from you, I hope. One, as Angela said, we need to get back to having the best education system in the world. Obviously, that's higher education, and it breaks our heart to see what's happening in Silicon Valley today. It's a 4-legged table. It's community colleges, it's our CSU system, it's our UC system, and it's our private college system. When The Economist does its annual ranking of the best universities in the world, and 3 of the top 15 are right here in our 9-county Bay Area, we should be proud of that. But we can't let it be decimated with this budget crisis. Confidentially? Yeah, that helps. We're pulling together a very small group of tech leaders and university leaders and others next month to figure out how do we lead the way to make sure that we are not decimated in our higher education system with cuts. We can't allow that to happen if we're really going to succeed and stay innovative. K-12, it's obvious. When I was growing up in public schools in California, we were among the best in the nation. It breaks my heart that my 2 little girls, 2-year-old and 7-year-old, don't have that right now in their schools across the board in California. It's fixable, but we have to get on it. It's money, but it's more than money. And then finally, pre-K. I have the pleasure of leading the Business Advisory Council for pre-K education in California. And the more research we see, the more we know that those brains are fusing at a very early age. And we have to get serious about pre-K and transitional kindergarten and not let that new law be decimated as we move forward. That's on the education side. But if we want to make sure that people have jobs when they get out of school in California, we have to make sure that there are jobs that they can compete for. And that's why we need that better business climate that you referred to. It wasn't the grass is always greener on the other side of the hill when CEOs have stated for 7 years in a row to CEO magazine that of the 50 states, California is the most difficult in which to place jobs and do business. Fortune and Forbes had similar surveys. Global CEOs, not California CEOs thinking it looks better somewhere else, global CEOs in all those studies saying California is the least hospitable to producing jobs of all types. The best survey we've seen is MSNBC last summer, that is accused of having a liberal to moderate bent, and they rank California not 50th but 47th. Not a whole lot to celebrate there. And during the conversation, I hope we can talk about some specific solutions, because there are. It's not just problems. This is fixable. and we can produce jobs that those people coming out of our schools can compete for at all levels of that education ladder. I'll stop there so that we can get to more questions.
We'll want to get to specifics. Thank you, Carl. Before we do, Angela, I wanted to drill down a little more. You talked about the need for smart investments. Of course, this administration, the Obama administration, when it came in, spent hundreds of billions of dollars invested in a stimulus. Robert Reich talked about the Congressional Budget Office estimated it produced 3 million jobs. First of all, two-part question. Did you see the effects of that stimulus in the communities that you're working with? And second, what do those smart investments look like if you would do it differently?
Definitely saw the results of the investments in the communities we work with, and we work with communities all across the country. And I think the story of the impact of the Stimulus Act has not been widely heard in this country. It's not that it hasn't been told. It's been told repeatedly, but for some reason we can't hear these things. I think we're so bombarded with a narrative that everything's a failure, government can't work, that when people hear data, they don't quite hear it. So know it. Yes, jobs were created in every community that we work in. We've seen them. It's easier for us to see them because we work with the communities that we're trying to come up with the strategies to be able to use those dollars effectively. We saw them in terms of transportation. We saw them in terms of communities really renovating parks. We saw them in so many different ways. We also saw the benefits to communities, what it means to be able to keep police officers and teachers and librarians, jobs saved, very important for communities. And it could have done more. The thing that I criticized it for was the same thing that Robert Reich criticized it for. It wasn't targeted enough. We have so much knowledge about where you get the most out of investments in infrastructure. For example, you get significantly more jobs when you invest in public transportation than in building roads and highways. You get significantly more jobs when you fix roads and highways rather than build new ones. When we have that kind of knowledge, we should be targeting those jobs. The other thing that I've seen, $500 million project in St. Louis, 30% of the jobs targeted to low-income people in communities that really needed those jobs. 0.5% of all of that set aside for job training programs for people who needed to get ready for jobs. And so, absolutely, we were able to see progress. But if we do anything like that again, I really hope that we'll say, who do we need to target? How do we need to target them? How do we make sure that resources get in the right places and that we can celebrate doing it? That too often when we target, people think, I'm not being targeted, it's not good. Rather than understanding that if some people in some places are targeted, we all benefit. We have lost the sense of we in this nation. And until we get the sense of we back, politically, we're never going to be able to do the things that we know how to do. We are not a poor country. We need to stop acting like one.
Let me drill down a little more with you, Carl. You mentioned that there are specific things that you think the state government, local governments can do to make California more competitive. What does your wish list look like?
Boy, and I'd love to have that question as well. Can I get to that at some point? Angela?
Absolutely.
Great.
In fact, if you want to do that first, and then we'll get to your
That
wish
sounds
list.
great. That way Angela
During
doesn't
the
have to go
holiday
first
season.
all the time. Great. The most significant word that Angela just said, which brought the biggest smile to my face, was we. I'm not part of the 1%. I want to be part of the 100%. That's what made California and the United States great, was that we attitude. My father was a first generation, his parents from Italy. Blue collar, construction worker, 6 mouths to feed. My mom was a stay-at-home mom who worked harder than anyone I've ever met. Never complained about taxes. We always knew that that was part of what democracy was all about. And I, for one, am willing to pay more taxes. I want to make sure that they're transparent and accountable. We all want that. But I would never want to be, this is important to me, so I want you to pay for it. If it's important for California's success, if it's important for our nation's success, we're in this together. and that's why that we word was so important. The stimulus, if I may. We had no problem with the stimulus, but I agree with Angela. But you learn as you go, so I'm not going to pick on the President and Congress on this, but you learn as you go. That was over $700 billion. I would have liked to have seen a lot more go to transportation and a lot more go to public transportation. I'm one of 9 gubernatorial appointees on the California Transportation Commission, and very little went to transportation as a percent to the whole, which helps provide jobs for people, for putting people to work that help the rest of us get to work. So it's a double payback in my time with transportation. But the percent to whole of that $700+ billion stimulus package, very little was for transportation. And the amount that was mainly for roads, because it was shovel-ready work. It wasn't long-term work in terms of transit investment. So we're together on that. So let me tell you about a stimulus package that doesn't cost taxpayers anything. And that really excites us for the opportunity in Silicon Valley and across America's innovation economy. And it is called, it's a kind of a strange word called repatriation. It's bringing back foreign earnings that our companies compete for successfully in a global marketplace. Our companies compete globally because 95% of the world's markets are overseas. Only 5% are here. And you're not going to compete successfully if you're not competing globally. Well, you earn all that money overseas. If you ever want to bring a dime back between federal corporate tax rate and California's corporate tax rate, it's 39.4%. You can borrow money at 2 or 3%. No one can bring it back. It's locked overseas. If we allowed that to come back, it's estimated at $1.4 trillion today. And not all would come back, but more than the stimulus package. And putting back that into the American economy at a lower rate so people brought it back would put about $50 billion into the US Treasury for the programs we all hold dear, and the rest to jumpstart that economy here in the United States. So there are many ways to do a stimulus. Didn't argue with that one. We want to see a private sector stimulus with private dollars that doesn't cost taxpayers anything.
Carl, what is happening to those dollars that are not coming back? Are they being invested overseas?
Yeah, because eventually you have to use your money to stay competitive. And that means more and more you look for how you can use that money to continue to grow and make your company competitive. So the longer we wait, the more of those funds are used for overseas operations, employing people, equipment, facilities, et cetera. Most companies have facilities and equipment around the world, by the way, and the reason is obvious. The markets are around the world. But we want to make sure that the money that companies have is not kept overseas because of policy decisions that can be fixed. If it can be brought back here and used to stimulate the American economy, grow jobs, grow facilities, grow equipment, grow R&D, we want it to be.
Carl, I want to commend you on your restraint. When I asked you for your wish list, I thought I was going to hear about visa reform, single sales factor, CEQA, et cetera. You only had one, that's repatriation. So I'm not giving you back the mic.
He'll get it back,
Just
though.
commending you for restraint. Angela, you made a really important point in your opening, and that's in the disparities, which of course was the subject of not just this PPIC report, but I remember probably 10 years ago that Mark brought in a study that the PPIC did. It was called, I believe, the 2020 report, back when 2020 seemed a long ways away. It's coming up on us. And one of the points that it made was the mismatch between the growth of population demographically in California and the levels of education and others that other factors that are needed to provide the skilled workforce that the state's going to need. What do you think the keys are to addressing some of these disparities in income and certainly the educational achievement gap? How can that be addressed? It seems like that, we talked earlier in the first session, there was a lot of talk about the demographic issue being of the aging population, but there's also the diversification of the population and the unequal opportunities we have in there. What are your thoughts there?
Yes, when they began to talk about the demographic issues in the first panel, I thought they were going to talk about the changing racial and ethnic makeup, because that really is such a huge story, and it will be the story for decades and decades to come. as we think about the baby boomers and how they defined America for so many years, as we look at people of color becoming more and more the majority of the population, both in terms of the needs, but the contributions and the culture, the nation's going to see quite a shift. I view it as an amazing gift to the nation, an amazing gift. Because when you think about the nations that are going to have the capacity to really be powerful and competitive and leaders in the globe, it's going to be the world nation. The nation that has the language connection, the cultural connection, the relatives in other places, and we will have all of that, the ability to identify out there. But when we think about that possibility, it is only an asset if we invest in it. And the most important investment is education and readiness. How many times do we have to say it before we take it up? Why don't we take it up? It is a political problem. And let me be really blunt about the nature of that political problem. I talked to you about the fact that nationally, 46.5% of the children are children of color. 80% of those over 65 in this nation are white. 60% of those in California are children of color, but 70% of those over 65 are white. One of the places that has the biggest gap between those who are older and those who are younger is Arizona. And we see what's happening there in terms of not being able to have the political will to move forward. Again, we know how to get children ready for school when they start. We know how to do that. Anybody, I don't care what community you live in, you can point to a place where there's a high-quality early childhood program that's delivering children to the schoolhouse door ready. We know how to do K-12 education well. Every community has at least one school that's knocking it out of the ballpark. We know that these things are absolutely essential for young people to be ready to be contributing adults. We know how to do good community college work. You talked about it. I know you've seen it, and I know you've led it. And you know we know how to do higher education. This is not an issue of an absence of knowledge. This is an absence of political will to be able to make that which we know how to do well available to all. And until we begin to have this discussion, I don't like coming into audiences and being the one to raise the race issue all the time. I know that very often people would rather not go there, rather not talk about it. And I, as much as anybody, want to be liked. But I feel that it is important that we raise this issue, because if we don't raise it, we won't confront ourselves with the question, well, why haven't we done the right thing? Why aren't we doing it? And bringing that question into our lives, into our dinner tables, into our Thanksgiving dinner conversation is the only way that as a nation we're going to overcome the political blockage. And California has the ability to lead the nation in showing how it is you invest in the people who are there and you get what it is you need.
I think this PPIC report really brought it into high relief when it talked about not only the disparities among races, but if you compare, I was most struck in this report by comparing not what happened in the Great Recession,
Right.
which is just one of several blips over the last few decades, but if you compare 1980 to 2010, you have the 90 percentile income went up 34%, even though it went down a little bit during the Great Recession. The bottom 10 percentile went down 24%. I mean, we definitely have seen that movement.
It's stark.
Let me ask you, let me put the question a little focus to you, Carl. I was covering the state capitol for the Denver Post in the 1980s when Colorado had a very severe recession. It was a Republican-controlled legislature. The big push for increasing education funding was from the business community. Why aren't we seeing that in California?
I think we're going to in 2012.
And I'm accepting, I'm making an exception for the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, which has been very aggressive in arguing for public investment, be it transportation or education. But I don't see it generally. I don't see the California Chamber of Commerce, when they come up with their list of job killer bills, which is very influential in Sacramento, I never see education cuts under the job killer list. Why not?
Well, first of all, the quality of our education system should be considered a job creator bill. And one of the reasons why I just love PPIC is, like the leadership group, and obviously what I've already heard from PolicyLink, is we're solutions oriented. So let me give just a couple of stats on this and then jump into solutions. Of all the demographic studies that I've seen, the one that to me is most telling about California's future on unemployment isn't race, isn't gender. It is education. If you have a college diploma and you're 25 years old or older in California, a college diploma in any subject, the unemployment rate is about 4%. As we saw in Sarah and Eric's report, if you have a high school diploma or less, the unemployment rate is above 13%. It's a skills gap. If you have an engineering degree in Silicon Valley today, you're writing your own ticket. Science degrees in any subject, even my science degree, political science, the only true science, it's 4%. And that's why it's so important. So let me just mention a couple of things on the issue that Angela raised, and I'm glad she did, about ethnicity. I'm a white male. We have two daughters, a 7-year-old Jessica and a 2-year-old Sienna. And Jessica was born through her parents, my wife and I, and Sienna was adopted 2.5 years ago, 1 day old, out of a hospital in Ogden, Utah. And Sienna is 100% Latina, born of 2 teenage kids who already had, they were 17 years old, they already had a 2-year-old. No high school diplomas, no jobs, really sweet people, really smart people, but a culture where education was not what was emphasized. So we peeled back that onion, and we've learned a lot about Latinas in California and across the country in terms of high school graduation rates, college attendance rates, let alone college graduation rates, and it's deplorable. So this has become our personal quest, which fits my professional quest as well. And I hope we'll have time to go into it. But the policies that our state needs to do, but also the programs and projects that each of us can do to make sure that people are inspired and have opportunities to rise up in their own education pursuits and success that we're doing at the leadership group that hopefully we'll be able to share later as we continue to drill down. The last thing I would mention, and I mentioned it earlier, personally, I'm willing to pay more taxes. Professionally, as the CEO of an organization of 345 CEOs of innovation economy companies, large and small, we do an annual CEO business climate survey. We're in the field right now for the 8th annual. In the 7th and in the 6th and in the 5th, we ask, California's a mess, the budget's a mess. Is there anything that you'd be willing to pay higher taxes for? There were several topics, but among those, pre-K education, K-12 education, higher education, infrastructure investment for roads and public transit across the board. We will invest when we know there's accountability and transparency, and we can always have that in California. So education, I think you're going to see it big in 2012 with a lot of regional business groups, perhaps not some of our statewide partners, hopefully we will, but among the regional business groups who are often closest to the challenges, you're going to see it more and more.
Carl, both you and Angela are really what you're talking about here are long-term investments as opposed to a short-term stimulus. And the question let's start with you, Angela, is to who's going to do this long-term thinking for the state? We're not seeing it in Sacramento. We have a term-limited legislature where most of the members will not be in the House that they're in longer than 8 years. In the business community, we have businesses that are feeling the global competition. They're also worried about they may not even be around in a few years. Where do you see this leadership coming from?
It has to come from the California people. It has to come from the American people, and I think that it will. The question that was asked earlier, how many of you think your children will not do as well as you? Not only will your children not do as well, but for so many Californians and Americans, your children will not live as long. And this is the first time that has ever happened. That I was on the commission of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, commissioned to build a healthier America. And it was our #1 finding that we're witnessing the first generation of children not expected to live as long as their parents. If we begin to help the American people understand that we are in a crisis, that we must act now and we must act for the future. The American people and the California people will begin to demand it, that we have to think about how we're going to secure the future for our children. It requires that our children, it has to be all of our children. All of our children are our children, and our future as a nation depends on it. I believe that one of the things that's happened in this nation, sadly, is that our racial divide has become a generational divide, and all of the young are suffering because of it. Let me say what I mean by that. We've had a racial divide in the country, and we know that, which is why we have so many communities that suffer underinvestment, why we have so many schools that are poor, that we have so many people who are in prison. We've had a racial divide. We haven't embraced the other, and we haven't developed a policy agenda that allows all to reach their full potential. As we've gotten to the point where more and more of children and young people are that other, we're investing less in young people. But if you're a young family moving to a city hoping to send your children to public schools, you're going to be sorely disappointed, even if you're white. If you're a young worker and you've moved to an urban area and you're hoping to save money by taking public transportation, you're going to be disappointed, even if you're white. Our racial divide has become a generational divide. And the more that we begin to understand that, and understand that the future depends on what we do for those who are coming, no matter who they are, I think the American people are going to demand our elected officials, our business leaders, and others think long term, because we must.
Let's get to this question of the opportunity society that you talked about. I want to put it to you, start with you, Carl, on this. There were a couple of interesting findings in that PPIC poll. As Mark pointed out, Mark Baldessari, more Californians now are seeing themselves as the have-nots in this divided state. And also, I also found it very interesting, if you add up in that poll those who support the Occupy movement and those who support the Tea Party movement, with the caveat of warning journalists doing math, it adds up to 83%. That's a lot of frustrated people out there. Silicon Valley has always been the land of hope and opportunity and belief that the next big thing is coming along. Does that spirit still exist there?
Absolutely. The spirit of Silicon Valley, the innovation economy, is thriving. And it is like an island of entrepreneurialism among a sea of despair, and it's sad. What's wonderful, though, about the innovation economy is it's not rooted solely in Silicon Valley, but it's in regions and states and nations around the world. If you haven't followed Doug Hinton's work, who's here today, you really should, in collaborative economics, because he really strikes at this core. I'm going to mention one thing about term limits, though. First, I oppose term limits. I think it's lazy person's democracy. Okay. We have an opportunity in June to at least change it a little bit in California by an effort led by the LA Chamber and the LA AFL-CIO, which is the type of partnerships we need more of in California. But that is, instead of 6 years in the Assembly, 8 in the Senate, term limited. You can do less, 12 total instead of 14, but in any house that you want. So you actually gain some expertise. You're not starting your first day in office thinking about what you're going to run for next, and you can have more of that long-term thinking that Angela so correctly pointed to. But we also can't let, term limits or not, we can't let elected officials use that as an excuse. We have to hold their feet to the fire. When elected officials from Sacramento come in and meet with us and our CEOs and they say, well, you don't understand because I'm term limited, the average life expectancy of a CEO in an innovation economy company is 5.5 years. So when an assemblyman says 6 years and I'm termed out, so what? And they're up to before their voters every 2 years. CEOs are up before their voters every 3 months. So no excuses about not thinking both short and long term. That's the way we have to be in California, regardless of the consequences. So going back to the Occupy movement and the Tea Party movement, I understand the frustration on both sides. But I also think that, as I said, the spirit of Silicon Valley, and certainly my own spirit, is that we need to be working together rather than pointing fingers at others. When I hear Tea Partiers say that we have no need for any investment in government, I wonder how they were able to get to their job or their school or anything else that is needed in a civil society. when I hear people who are part of the Occupy movement or identifying with the Occupy movement saying, we're 99, let's have the one, quote unquote, pay their fair share. Let's all pay our fair share. Other than the most vulnerable and poor in our society, why aren't we all contributing to make California and our nation great? And I see both sides. When I hear the Occupy people say 1% of the population has 20% of the wealth, that's a fair point. But when that 1% is also paying 37% of the federal income tax and 37% of the state income tax, that's a fair point too. When 50% of Californians are paying 97% of all state income tax and 50% of us are paying 2%, and a big portion of that aren't paying anything, and some portion of that probably shouldn't pay anything. But I would rather see all of us contribute as much as we can, because then you own the state. If you're not contributing, you don't have that sense of ownership. And the more I think that we all own California and the United States, the more we're invested in it, the more we care about its future, and the more, as Angela said, we're making sure that we have all that we need so that our kids and our families succeed.
Want to get to audience questions, but first one quick question for Angela. I suspect this optimism that pervades Silicon Valley is not necessarily universal from what you see.
Oh, no, it's not universal, but I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic, and I work with a lot of people who are optimistic. You would be surprised. PolicyLink had a big summit just a month ago in Detroit called, I want to say it was called America's Tomorrow. It was not. It was called Equity 2011, Healthy Communities, Strong Regions, a Prosperous America. And there were 2,300 people there, all talking about equity, thinking about the future, digging down hard on infrastructure questions, looking at what to do around education, looking at how where you live is a proxy for opportunity, and how do we make sure that all communities are healthy places with places to exercise, with grocery stores and other places where you can get fresh fruits and vegetables. And to frame it, we did this report, which is called America's Tomorrow, Equity is the Superior Growth Model. I can't tell you how optimistic and enthusiastic those people were. And I am, and my staff is, because while we see the problems, and it's clear we're in a grown zone and who knows how long we're going to be in it, it's also clear that the old way is not going to be the future long term. It just isn't. We're in this sort of last gasp moment for some forces that are not good. You don't know how dangerous people will be in that last gasp. You don't know how long it's going to last. But it's clear that it's the past. It is not the future. We're excited about helping the American people understand it can be a bright future, getting on the right path, figuring out how to have a vibrant democracy. And so I think that we do share the optimism. We know it's going to be hard. I probably know many, many, many people who know many, many, many people who are doing frighteningly bad right now. But as we think about our job as a state, as a nation, to be able to create pathways so all can reach their full potential, that is a mission that is gaining momentum. And to just say a word about Occupy Wall Street, in a society with a free press, it is shocking to me that people have to occupy the way they have to get the press to talk about inequality. But they did, and it is, and I can only applaud.
Let's go with some audience questions. You know you.
Come on.
There we go.
My name is Amber. I had a question about health reform, especially related to businesses. I overheard a conversation with a small business owner in Arizona, and he was saying that he was concerned about hiring more people because he was afraid that health reform was going to limit some of his profits. And so my question is whether or not any of the companies that you work with have concerns about health reform, and if so, what you think, how the governments can work with the businesses better to sort of mitigate those concerns.
Thanks, Amber. I'm going to admit off the top that healthcare and health reform issues are not my areas of expertise. I have wonderful people on my team who focus on that. So with that caveat, what we hear from our members is two things. One, that as the health reform legislation went through and was signed into law, it's a shame that it doesn't bend the cost curve. for employers or workers as we had all hoped. And so costs do look like the trajectory is going up, and that's scary. As a CEO of a small nonprofit of 24 people, our healthcare costs go up double digits every year. So I feel for that small business person in Arizona, whether it's for or nonprofit, because that's the reality we face. And we do need to do something about that for both employers and workers and people who don't have jobs. So I'll put that caveat there. But when we test in that annual CEO survey, and when we asked last year, with no idea what the answer would be from several hundred CEO respondents, as you look at the National Healthcare Reform Bill, do you think that we should keep it or throw it out? The majority felt that we should keep it. They were on that side of the spectrum. So there's an acknowledgement we really have to do something, but we still have to do more to make sure that the cost of healthcare in this country is more affordable.
Am I right?
Hi. Well, my question was more specific towards the overarching theme, which was education and private firms, that there are available jobs, but they are in higher education. My question is this: why have companies such as Google or Apple not invested in more trade-specific schooling that can, be people can attend at a junior college, who can actually start coding or developing rather than attending these universities? I graduated from UCSD. My starting tuition was $2,200. By the time I left, it was about $4,000. So $4,000 a quarter is a lot. So if there are growing jobs in that sector, like electricians who go to a trade school, why not create that same trade environment?
Yeah, and this is such an excellent question. You were looking at me, so I'll respond first, but then turn it over to Angela. First, we're big believers in career tech ed and ladders that you can get on and off throughout your life in terms of education. It's a lot of people don't know, but the last time we researched it, which was only about 2 years ago, about 1 of every 4 really well-paying jobs in Silicon Valley required a community college degree or just technical training. And these are good middle class to upper middle class jobs. But this is where policy matters. It comes back to the discussion that we were asked to engage in today. Because some folks will never have that skill set or that passion to do what you have done. But they still would like to work and care to work in California. Let me give an example of how policy matters here. Data center jobs, warehouse jobs. We hear all the time, especially from our friends in the Central Valley, where there's regions of 25, 30, 35% unemployment for years now. Why can't you place those warehouse jobs and data center jobs here? Our people are hardworking. They want to be employed. They have high school diplomas, sometimes some college. They're smart people. And I'm going to say something really controversial. When you go through tough times like this, you either think that it is cyclical or systemic. And overwhelmingly in Silicon Valley, we think it's systemic. Overwhelmingly in Sacramento, people think it's cyclical. In reality, it's a combination of the two. But how you address solutions is based on how you see that fundamental question. And if you think it's cyclical, you do at most small changes because you're going to get out of it. If you think it's systemic, you're willing to aim for bigger changes because you know something is fundamentally broken. And I'll give an example that's very controversial. And I was raised in a union household. I have strong support for building trades and other unions. But California is one of 3 states out of 50 that applies overtime to an 8-hour day instead of a 40-hour week. And when you're talking about those data center jobs and those facility and warehouse jobs that we'd like to have in California, for a Netflix or someone else to consider that, you can hire 10 hardworking Californians or 15 hardworking Nevadians or Oregonians or Arizonians or New Mexicans because they have a 40-hour week for overtime, and it's just the math versus an 8-hour day for overtime. One policy change that impacts so many middle-class jobs from not being created in California. Policy matters. Details matter.
Don't worry about being controversial. This audience has already shown it likes crazy ideas, actually.
Got it.
I'm interested in your thoughts. And also, specific to that point, but also the more general question, is this really the role of education to try to calibrate its students for the jobs that are there today? Because when we look at these long-term trends, like when, in the PPIC report comparing 1980 to 2010, a lot of the jobs that we have today did not even exist in 1980. Can we go too far?
I think that we should be aware of what the jobs are, what the skill sets are, and there should be some relationship between the education and training and information that people get so that they can make choices and be prepared to make choices that'll be good for them. Middle skilled jobs are the jobs in California that people really ought to be looking at. In many ways, getting a good middle skilled job will pay more than some of the jobs that people would get if they got college degrees. And the thing that is, it's complex, because you'll find lots of people who are Black and Latino who are not eager to embrace this notion of training for those jobs. They think it reminds them of the vocational education period in America, in which people who were Black and Latino were often tracked into jobs where they had no, in terms of their education, where they had no possibility when they finished education of being able to go to college. And now people don't understand that these are different kinds of jobs now. That's one thing they don't understand, is how well they're going to pay. The other thing that's not understood is it requires the same level of elementary, high school education to be able to do those jobs well as to go to college. So if we were really educating young people well, they could get to a point where they could choose to go a 4-year institution or a 2-year institution or something else. And so we've got to educate people about what the jobs are, what they pay, what's needed. We have to have an educational system that is top-notch, because there are no jobs for people who don't know how to read and compute anymore, and you have to be able to do that at a high level. And we need to help the community college system be the robust system that it has to be in order to be able to fill the needs of the future. One example of a perfect program is PG&E Power Pathway, in which they identified who was retiring, they identified the jobs they were doing, identified the jobs for the future, developed a relationship with community colleges, and they're training young people to be able to get those jobs. They're getting good salaries and good career ladders.
We get a mic up to Peter here?
Right.
Great. Oh, great. Thanks.
Okay. Carl Guardino, you cited a number of employer surveys showing, indicating that they thought California was a bad place to do business. PPIC, I think 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I can't remember, published a report indicating that taxes were not a major factor in driving businesses out of California. Do you have hard data showing how the business climate is in fact inimical to business in California? You have hard data. I don't mean surveys which are based on who knows what impressions, but hard data. The other question I had is, when you said Netflix would do better with a warehouse in Nevada, how is it Nevada has a higher unemployment rate than California?
And that's fine. I could have easily picked it. And I named several states, Peter. First of all, it's great to see you, Peter. The example of the 40-hour week to the 8-hour day wasn't because Netflix, not because Nevada has the highest unemployment rate in the nation and California has the second. I was giving examples of neighboring states on one policy issue. In terms of tax policies, do tax policies matter? Yeah, they do, Peter. So do regulatory policies.
I'm wondering whether you have hard data showing the link, the nexus.
The question for those who didn't hear was whether there is hard data showing that connection.
Yeah, on tax policies, yeah, let's follow up offline, because what I'd be happy to do is pull together data to help you see that. We may not agree at the end of the day, but from the perspective of employers in Silicon Valley, the biggest issue is regulatory uncertainty more than tax rates, which is why, as I mentioned throughout my comments, the willingness of CEOs in Silicon Valley to support higher taxes for government services that we think are important. So I don't think I talked about tax policy as a driver out of California. I think you mentioned that. The bigger one that we hear about is regulatory uncertainty.
want to thank all the audience members for your terrific questions and your attention this afternoon. Please also, let's thank Angela Glover Blackwell and Carl Guardino for their participation today.